Every time you hold a US dollar, you're holding a promise made by an institution that most people don't truly understand, an institution that controls interest rates, shapes recessions, fuels booms, and rescues or destroys entire economies. But here's the strange part. It's not exactly a government agency. It's not exactly private either. And yet, it has more power than both. This is the story of the Federal Reserve, the hidden empire that quietly owns the financial heartbeat of the world. Stay until the end. Because by the time you finish this video, you'll understand why money itself may be the greatest illusion ever created. And before we dive in, we're building the biggest finance and trading channel on YouTube. If you want to understand how money, power, and markets truly work, make sure you hit subscribe. Let's rewind to the early 1900s. America was booming, industrialization was exploding, but behind the progress, chaos. Financial panics were common. Banks failed overnight. People's life savings disappeared without warning. In 1907, it happened again. The Panic of 1907. Markets crashed, banks collapsed. The U.S. Treasury had to beg one man to save the system, J.P. Morgan. One private banker stepped in and saved the U.S. economy. That moment terrified Washington. They realized if one man could rescue the system, then one man owned it. So in 1910, a secret meeting took place at Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private island owned by bankers and industrialists. Under total secrecy, some of the most powerful men in finance, from Morgan's Group, Rockefeller Interests, and Kuhn, Loeb and Company, gathered with Senator Nelson Aldrich. Their mission? To design a new financial system that would stabilize markets while quietly centralizing control. Out of that meeting came the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. 3 years later, in 1913, the U.S. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. On paper, it was meant to protect the people, to stop panics and smooth out the economy. But in reality, it handed over the nation's monetary system to a network of private banks, under the supervision of a central board. Here's how it was structured. The Board of Governors in Washington, appointed by the president, 12 regional reserve banks, owned by private member banks, and commercial banks required to hold reserves within this system. It looked like a public institution, but at its core, it was a private banking cartel with the power to issue the nation's money for profit. Even Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr. warned, the new law establishes the most gigantic trust on earth, the invisible government of the monetary power. Here's the part that shocks most people. The Federal Reserve doesn't just regulate money, it creates it. When the U.S. government needs money, it issues bonds, essentially IOUs. The Federal Reserve buys those bonds, and in return, creates new dollars out of thin air. That's not conspiracy, that's accounting. Every digital dollar sitting in a bank today began as a liability on the Fed's balance sheet. Over time, this gave the Fed the most extraordinary power imaginable. The power to expand or contract the money supply at will. When it lowers interest rates, money floods the system. When it raises them, credit tightens and recessions follow. Booms and busts, inflation and deflation, bubbles and crashes, all can be traced in some way to decisions made by just a handful of people. Behind closed doors in Washington, D.C., the 1920s roared, stocks soared, debt skyrocketed. But in 1929, it all came crashing down. The Great Depression began, and millions lost everything. Later, economists like Milton Friedman argued that the Federal Reserve made it worse by shrinking the money supply too fast. By 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt took drastic action. He confiscated gold from U.S. citizens and ended the gold standard domestically. That meant you could no longer exchange dollars for gold. The link between money and tangible value was broken. And for the first time in history, money became based on trust and government decree. That's why it's called fiat currency. As World War II ended, the U.S. stood alone as the global superpower. Europe was destroyed, Asia was rebuilding, and in 1944, world leaders met at Bretton Woods to decide how the new global financial system would work. Their solution? Peg every major currency to the U.S. dollar and the dollar to gold. It was stability through hierarchy. And at the top stood the American dollar, backed by the world's largest gold reserves. The system made sense until America began printing more dollars than it had gold to back. By 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard completely. From that moment, the dollar became pure fiat, a currency backed not by gold, but by confidence. And who manages that confidence? The Federal Reserve. Once the gold link was gone, something incredible happened. Debt exploded, inflation grew, and the U.S. economy shifted from production to credit expansion. The Federal Reserve began using interest rates as a tool to manage growth and to save the system from itself. Every crisis, from the 1987 crash to the 2008 financial meltdown, brought one answer: lower rates, print more money, inflate the system. By 2020, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet had exploded to over $8 trillion. Money had become digital, infinite, and fragile. Now the million-dollar question: who really owns the Fed? The truth is complicated. Technically, the 12 regional reserve banks are privately owned by member banks that hold stock in the system. But that stock doesn't function like normal corporate shares. It can't be sold or traded. The profits from Fed operations go to the U.S. Treasury after paying a small dividend to member banks. So while it's not owned by families like the Rothschilds or Rockefellers in the direct sense, the system itself was designed by bankers for bankers. It operates independently of Congress and even the president. And in a world where money equals power, that independence makes it the most powerful institution on earth. Today, the Federal Reserve's decisions ripple through every corner of the planet. When the Fed raises interest rates, currencies collapse. When it prints money, asset prices explode. Global central banks mirror its moves. Emerging markets borrow in dollars. Oil, gold, and even Bitcoin all react to the pulse of the U.S. dollar. The Fed has become the world's de facto central bank. And yet, most people couldn't name a single member of the Federal Open Market Committee, the group that sets rates. Some say the Fed is a stabilizer, a guardian of economic order. Others claim it's the ultimate tool of control, keeping nations indebted and citizens enslaved through inflation. Throughout history, presidents like John F. Kennedy and Andrew Jackson fought against centralized banking. Jackson even abolished the second bank of the U.S., calling it a den of vipers. Yet here we are, in 2025, and the Federal Reserve stands stronger than ever. Now the conversation is shifting toward the next evolution. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, digital money issued and tracked by the same institution that already controls the supply of cash. A system where every transaction could theoretically be monitored, controlled, perfected. As the world drifts toward digital money, many wonder, will this be the end of financial freedom or the next logical step in monetary evolution? The truth might be both. The Federal Reserve isn't just a bank. It's a mirror of human behavior. It amplifies greed, fear, and trust. It expands when we spend, contracts when we panic. And while critics dream of ending it, the reality is it has become the system itself. To dismantle it would mean rebuilding the world economy from the ground up. So next time you see a dollar bill, look closely. You'll see the words Federal Reserve Note. That note is more than paper. It's power. Power built on belief. Because in the end, money is not backed by gold or governments. It's backed by trust. And trust is the most valuable currency of all. We're building the biggest finance and trading channel on YouTube. Subscribe, because the next video might just change the way you see money forever.